This is part 3 of the demo. In this section, we're going to show the code itself, just kind of this code structure, just get into it for about a few minutes here. The application from OA Builder is generated out, and this is what we're going to see here. This is the directory structure, and again, it kind of follows the model view control. So we got the model here, we got the view, we got the control. All this code can be generated through OA Builder. And like I mentioned in the previous video, is basically what it can do is it takes your model, takes the information about the model, and it stages that data through code generation. And part of the code generation stages is there's templating, and there's also straight code generation, where it's basically just creating a file, running through various generators and stuff like that, and uses a level of that to then produce the application. So, to create your objects, it's pretty straightforward. To create your data source, it's pretty difficult. And that's your SQL, your DDL, and that's also kept in sync with changes as your model progresses and stuff like that. So it keeps track of all that, keep them in sync with the changes. And then your UI, it basically, when it builds your UI, it builds it like you would build a UI in an application, where everything's built into these component-based, and it will actually take that model, and for all the objects and relationships in there, it will use that information to know what UI components to build and how to present them in layouts and stuff like that. So it's all the pieces, parts, and on top of that, then it's the layout. So based on that, it's able to really allow for just laying out the whole project in a really consistent way, so that from that model or any other model that we could be working on, we know that the layout's pretty straightforward, or it's always very consistent across. Obviously, your objects are different, the application's different, stuff like that, but how it works, how it's laid out, where you find stuff is very consistent. Under the controller, it's basically, there's a client side, server side. It also lets you set up for multiple apps in a distributed environment, running the services, cloud-based type stuff, where they can all connect and kind of all work together still as one. Or you can initially when I start an application, it's just running standalone. I'll run the clients, I'll run the web apps and stuff like that straight from there. My database, I have data generators that will automatically generate sample data, just so I can go in and start testing it, make sure everything's landing in the right place and looks good, and start forming it that way. Then I get to a certain point, and then I'll pick a database, or start with maybe an embedded database like the Java DB, and just kind of go from there. But what this would give me is just, it'll start up right away. It'll start up, have logging built in. Again, consistency is really important. So how the logging gets done, how you monitor your apps, and how you track everything is all built into this too. The data source manages your database connection pooling and all that kind of stuff. And also managing your ORM and all that. Within your application, you really, all that's managed for us. So in our application, we're just dealing with objects. So if we want to select something, or filter it, sort it, or anything like that, we basically, it's like just dealing with any collection class that would run it through a filter, or would query off of it, and it would basically work directly off of that. And based on where the data is, if it's in a cache, or if it's in the database, if it's on the server, it's already on the client, if it's on a different server, it automatically brings all that in. And it also has a lot of performance-based ways of handling that, so that it seems like the data is just always available. The M is and the MVC is the model. So if we look at the model, we can basically see that if we drill into it a little bit more, we have what's called the OA objects, which basically represent if we look at the sales order, in the last video, we were looking at that object. We can actually see, I'm going to scroll down to, here's all your properties. That's it's the properties that was in there. And these objects are all based on a subclass of what's called OA object, and that OA object will make your object observable. Observable means within your application and across applications. So if a change happens in an object, it can automatically be changed across multiple servers. It can it's observable in a way that it can be dynamically updated across servers, and again internally, your UI type binding and other listener code that manages or is waiting for certain types of changes and stuff like that. It's basically, that's the reactive nature of it. A lot of that's just defined in the model, but that capability allowing what we can do, we can also model out different things that you want to happen, like maybe automated emails or something that gets batched up, or a running list of alerts, that type of thing. But lots of capability built in there just because you have what's built on top of the capability that observable gives us. So within these objects, it has references to all of its objects. So in this case, here's all the properties that we know about it, but here's all of its references. So again, in the last video, we were talking about how a sales order has a price code. So from a sales order object, we can say get price code, and that method will automatically return us the price code without us having to do any mapping or know where that data is coming from. It's already associated with it. OA object, it also manages all that for us. So basically, if we looked at it from end to end, when you called get price code, if it was null, if it hasn't been loaded yet, it will then call OA object to go get it for us. OA object will might know what its unique value is, or GUID, or key, and be able to find it in the cache. If it doesn't find it, it will then either, if it's a server, go get it from the database or the data source, or from another server, or if it's a client app, it will actually request it from the server. Server will then do the similar thing on its side. And again, longest case scenario would be that it gets it from the database and sends it back. It's also smart enough to know how the data is being accessed. In other words, this thread that's calling this method, there's information within the running app itself that has information about how it's all tied together. So when it does request this information, it's smart enough to also bring back sibling information, so that, again, you limit the amount of round trips that you have to make, and it makes it appear that these requests, the data is already loaded without having to preload. There's flags and stuff to kind of control all that, but for the most part, again, back to your model, it's pretty much comes straight off the model, and it's in there, and it's set up to work really well that way. So that's all of our model objects. That's the equivalent of like a DAO almost right there. It's really closer to observable POJO. Also within here, and I'm going to look again at the sales order. The sales order has object. There's also on top of it a sales order model, which further defines how they work together. Because now within your application, you're going to want to know what kind of things that it's allowed to do. Again, like for UI and stuff like that. So again, based on your model, it can go in and go ahead and set up all this information. So now at a higher level, we can actually create a UI by giving it the model objects that it's working with, but the actual model itself, which defines, some overall settings on how it works. And then from that, it's able to turn stuff on and off, visibility, on and off or not. So at the model level, the next part would be the view. Between those, we're just look at these real quick, is if we look at the remote level, that basically allows our applications to connect to other applications, clients to servers, services within multiple services, load balance. You have many of them, and load balance your work across them and stuff like that. But you still also want them to be able to share and stay in sync and stuff like that. Have remote method calls. Another layer that we have on top of how all this works is we have a communication using TCP. It's pretty much communication independent also, just like the database is independent, the UI is independent. It's kind of a theme throughout all the OA stuff is have a level of independence. I have a high level of MVC, observability, reactive nature, async, and stuff like that, and distribute it. So a big part of that is on top of what we get from what this remoting layer is using. And this remoting layer is using something in OA that we're going to look at in the next video that makes all that happen. So all of our remote calls and everything basically look like just like regular Java calls. And it automatically will go across the wire, do what it needs to do for it to get done. But from a programmer's perspective, it's just like calling another method call. Custom reports. Again, something else that's within OA is templating, HTML, XML, whatever format you want, and it's able to generate these custom reports. We have a custom report viewer, editor, PDF generator, all the stuff around that, real-time report updates. So all that's within here, and this would also define any custom reports that you could basically drop in there. Servlets, again, a lot of them are generated, but you can go in there and create a whole bunch of them out of there. Another thing that you can do is you actually take HTML templates. Your UX team that you're working with can automatically build out their pages and stuff like that without any code in it. So our components are able to actually poke into that page and control the page in a way that makes it interactive with the model objects. But we'll talk more about that in the next video with the stuff that OA has in it. The view is what we were talking about earlier with the client that we looked at. Again, I'm going to go to the sales order and then try to wrap this up. So with the code generation, one of the things that we have is we have a way of for all those objects to actually generate out all the pieces parts for the UI components. So if we look at, and this is a Swing app, but it could also do any other component sets, and it's kind of like an interface into another system, like an API and stuff. So the code generation, we're able to onboard other components in kind of a factory-based way. We kind of take them through a process. And then when the application code generator runs, it actually takes those components and it knows how to actually build out the code for them. And then it actually will, let's just look at some good ones here. So as it's building those out, so if we create a table, let's see, create table, let's do the create table. So this will actually create us a table. Table's highly interactive with rendering and editors and stuff like that. This is code that will create the whole thing. And again, in this case, it's a JFC, but if it was a different type of table and stuff like that, the code would look very similar, but it would actually be bringing in that code set. So what we do in that process is we will take the code set, we will basically subclass it out. In this case, we subclass it out as OA table, and that's and then we add some functionality for the binding and everything else, and then we kind of richen up the functionality that you can do in it and stuff like that across how the components can be embedded and work between themselves and stuff like that. And then this code here shows it actually adding the columns to it. And again, all this code's generated based on how the model was set up and how all that works. So that's a pretty quick tour of all that. It also is all of the kind of what you would call the frameworks for all this stuff that happened. For the startup code, for the UI code, and all that stuff, and also the concurrency part of it. So how are the threads being used? What gets done in the background? All that, you can see that within the app. So one of the things I always say, at worst, we can have a running app up and running pretty quick. That internally we can get to everything in our app and see everything running. So that's the end of this video. The next one, we're going to get into the OA side, kind of what's under a lot of how this works. But what's nice is we got to kind of go through these last 3 videos and show just a whole process of a model-driven way of building out an application, but also going into it and seeing where how it all lines up, and the layers of how it's set up, and kind of how a framework works within it, kind of like an architecture, infrastructure, and how it's all set up, and then the capabilities and stuff like that.